My name is Walter Soden. I have the honor of introducing the panel today. I'm a third-year doctoral student in Ethan's lab in the social psychology department here at Michigan. And like I said, this is an honor for me to introduce these fine scholars. I'll start with Dr. Mischel. Walter Mischel is the Robert Johnson Niven Professor of Humane Letters and Psychology at Columbia University. Professor Mischel has been identified as one of the most eminent psychologists living today. Professor Mischel's research has profoundly impacted the study of personality and self-control. His paradigm-changing monograph, Personality and Assessment, reshaped the study of personality, and his groundbreaking research on the delay of gratification with the marshmallow test is one of the best-known studies in psychology, as well as the title of his forthcoming book. Along with his outstanding publication record, Professor Mischel has also held several positions of leadership within the academy, to include president of the Association for Psychological Science and the editor of the journal Psychological Review. For this, Professor Mischel has been widely recognized for his contributions to the field. His awards include the John P. McGovern Award, the American Psychological Association's Distinguished Scientist Award, the Association for Psychological Science's William James Fellowship Lifetime Achievement Award, and most recently, the Grawemeyer Award, the biggest prize in psychology. Now, as great of all this is, I did find one blemish on Dr. Mischel's record. He graduated and got his PhD from that other school in Ohio. I'm not going to hold that against him. Go blue. Right next to him is David Laibson. Dr. Laibson is the Robert I. Goldman Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Professor Laibson is an expert in behavioral economics. He leads Harvard's Foundations of Human Behavioral Initiative, serves on the board of the Health and Retirement Study and the Pension Research Council, and is a research associate for the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has earned several prestigious awards to include the Marshall Scholarship and Harvard's Phi Beta Kappa Prize for Excellence in Teaching. Welcome, sir. And right next to him, on his right, is John Jonides. Dr. Jonides is the Daniel J. Weintraub Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience here at the University of Michigan. He is the director of the Michigan Cognitive Neuroimaging Lab and a senior editor for the journal Psychological Science. His research focuses on working memory and the influence of motivation on cognitive control, memory, and training. He's a prolific author, and his work has been featured in some of the most prestigious journals in our field, to include the Annual Review of Psychology, Nature, Neuroscience, PNAS, Psychological Science, and Science. His awards include the University of Michigan's Excellence in Research Award, the APA Master Lecturer Award, and the APS William James Fellow Lifetime Achievement Award. Welcome, sir. Dr. Chandra Sripada is an assistant professor here at Michigan in philosophy and psychiatry. Dr. Sripada's expertise is in ethics, moral psychology, and cognitive science. He has several publications and was awarded the Don Klein Early Career Investigator Award last year. Thank you, sir. Or welcome. Thank you. And finally, my boss, Dr. Ethan Kross, is an associate professor of psychology here at Michigan, and he's also the director of the Emotion and Self-Control Lab. Professor Kross' research focuses on self-control and emotion regulation. Last year, he was awarded both the Society of Experimental Social Psychology Early Career Investigator Award and the Sage Young Scholar Award. And recently, he found out that he is to receive the Janet Taylor Spence Award for early career contributions at next month's Association for Psychological Sciences annual convention in San Francisco. I'd like to welcome you all, and thank you.
Thanks, Walt. So, my name is Ethan, and I'm going to serve as the moderator today, which means I'm going to try to do my best to fade into the background while we hear these other gentlemen speak. So let me give you a little bit of background before we get started on how we're going to run today's session. The organizers of this event and I spent a lot of time trying to think about how can we make this second day really engaging. And we threw around a bunch of ideas, and what we settled on was, what if we could bring together 4 different scholars who all have expertise in self-control, but study this process from angles that are slightly different enough to maybe cause some friction when you bring them together, maybe not. But at the very least, when you bring them together, the hope was that these individuals would have a really stimulating conversation. So rather than asking any of these gentlemen to prepare presentations, the instruction to them was just come prepared with your brain intact, which was not difficult, and come prepared to speak. And everyone here has assured me that they are prepared to do so. So the idea here is that we're just going to have the kind of stimulating conversation that we often have in the confines of our own labs on a topic that we are all deeply, deeply interested in, which is self-control. Now, we've been compiling questions amongst ourselves as well as from students and faculty across the university over the past few months, and I've organized them. And the organizational structure is going to proceed as follows. It's going to have 4 parts. So we'll start off by trying to establish some common ground. So what do we mean when we talk about the construct of self-control, and really how does it work from a very basic point of view? We'll then transition into talking about one of the, I think, burning questions in the field right now, which is, can you actually train self-control? Those of you who attended Walter's talk know his answer to that question, but other people here might have a slightly different view on that issue. So can you train self-control? If so, what kind of effects do you think we might get, big or small? And importantly, how do you do it? We'll then turn to talking about public policy and public policy implications that research on self-control has. And we'll end by opening it up for a Q&A period for all of you. Although if some of you have deficits in self-control, like you must ask a question, please do so, and we'll decide whether to take it. So that's the game plan. So let's get started. So part 1 is establishing common ground. And one of the interesting things that emerged over the past few months when we asked people about, well, what do you want to know about self-control? One of the things that kept on coming up enough was people tend to equate self-control with 3 things, right? Cookies, drugs, and sex, right? And so my question for the 4 of you is whether that captures self-control. So is self-control really about inhibiting one's approach responses to appetitive stimuli of the sort I've just described, or is there more to it than that? And to get us started, I think let's ask one of our guests of honor, Walter Mischel.
Well, I can't help continuing to still be thinking about the remark that was made when I was introduced about going to that other school, the one in Ohio. And I want to make clear that the reason I went to the other school in Ohio, and it was a very long, long time ago, was because they gave me $50 more than this one. So, now, can I connect that to work on self-control? I'm not sure. I also want to say that among the colleagues on the panel here, there really are complicated relationships between us. We don't come to this independently quite, because Jonides and I have been collaborating for a long time on the neural correlates of self-control. David Laibson and I and his colleagues are in the middle of collaboration going on the economic consequences or the economic links. So we really have common ground already, and I suspect that you won't get a totally independent view of how things are, except that we have our philosopher colleague to keep us straight that way. On the question that Ethan asked me about, is it more than cookies and sex and drugs and so on, I think the part about self-control that's a bit less obvious and less frequently discussed, but that in my mind at least as important, is that one of the things that creates enormous control difficulties are that we're all subject to having lots of what is sort of therapeutically referred to by the non-expressive term negative affect. What's negative affect? It means that we get very angry, that we get aggressive, that we become furious even with the people we love the most and who matter to us most. And then we do all kinds of things that we later regret. So to me, one of the most interesting findings that comes from work on self-control that I and others have done is that having it can serve as a tremendously important buffer against the raw expression of negative emotions. It's the difference, as I briefly alluded in that Widiko study that's shown on the slide here again that I talked about yesterday, which is a camp for hugely troubled kids ranging in age from 7 to 19. We worked with the ones from 7 to 13. And they're there because they've got negative affect problems that express themselves in two ways. They're tremendously predisposed towards acting out, again, the clinical term, for expressing raw aggression and behaving in hugely uncontrolled ways that get them into deep trouble early in life, that completely screw up their school experience, and that really put them sort of into an outcast class very early in life. And one of the, to me, interesting things that we found at Widiko that I went over briefly yesterday is a correlation. Yes, it's only a correlation, but it's a highly significant correlation between how well they were able to distract themselves while waiting for a big bunch of M&Ms rather than ringing the bell and settling for just a few M&Ms. So this very simple HOP measure that is involving, a visceral or an appetitive reward was predictive and reasonably strongly predictive of their inability to essentially pause before enacting extreme aggression. They were still there because they were predisposed to high aggression, but their level of aggression was significantly less, much less, than the kids who didn't have that device. So in terms of what does it mean? It means that the regulation of negative emotions, which is, I think, at least as important as the regulation of appetitive behavior, is also subject to regulation and potentially subject to training if we think that can make a difference, and therefore subject to control. So I think it has both control of appetitive and control of negative. For me, both essentially vital parts of what self-control involves.
So expanding to negative, maybe I'll throw it over to you, Chandra. You have an insight into the psychiatric world. What do you think? I mean, issues like depression, anxiety, and other kinds of mood disorders, does it make sense to think about those as problems of self-control? All biases of stigma aside, do you think that that's an apt characterization?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. As you know, Ethan, because you've contributed to this literature and others here have as well, there is the phenomenon of emotion regulation, which one way to think about it is that, in ordinary language, we use self-control primarily, maybe the prototypical instance is the use of regulatory capacities to target appetitive motives. But there's a broader category of regulatory control. And self-control is one kind of instance when it's typically targeted at appetitive things. But there certainly is, as Professor Mischel pointed out, there's the capacity to reflect, evaluate, reappraise, and inhibit mood states, negative emotions, and things like that. And even more broadly than that, there's the capacity to inhibit habits, to inhibit kind of drives like hunger and thirst, thoughts like when you have a tune stuck in your head and you try to get it out. So there's a very broad ability to apply kind of suppression or even enhancement to a broad class of target states. And self-control directed at appetitive things is one instance of that.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think the term that I think gets at the phenomena we're talking about now, perhaps a little more specifically than self-control, is attention regulation. That is, I think, the mechanism that we're talking about that's fundamentally important and that involves executive function, the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and so on, is a mechanism of attention regulation so that one can essentially get mastery over what's going on in here. And looked at that way, I think it becomes really a very, very central thing for what the Tanner event is supposed to be about, which is human values, and in this particular case, I think actually human freedom. Because to me, it's the condition that gives individuals the ability to regulate what they experience and what they do. What they then decide to do when they ring the bell and so on is absolutely their choice. And therefore, I think it also leads to a different view of causation, so that if we're asking philosophical questions, for example, about what's the cause of behavior, I mean, I've been very curious how in my long lifetime the conception of human causation has shifted. When I got into the business of psychology, it was all behaviorism. So causation was, there was, the idea that there's stuff going on in the head was considered that's the black box, and that if we are not in the business of talking about fictions, no matter how convenient they are, and we don't deal with those quote fictions. And therefore, behavior is all about the regulation of incentives, of rewards, of punishments, and of what's pushing us around. So from a Skinnerian point of view, we are under stimulus control, and it's not about the concept of self-control. Both the self part and the control part are simply not even in the language. With the cognitive revolution, that shifted dramatically, so the cognition came in, but the emotion was forgotten. So there was another 20-year period, much more recent. It's only much more recently that we're including a much broader conception of what goes on into an analysis of causation. But the reason I'm dragging this into the conversation, because I think it again has to do with issues of what is freedom and choice about, and what are the conditions that enable us to really decide that we're going to ring the bell or not ring the bell, rather than have the bell and the cookies or the anger be the determinant of what we do. That's how do we get out from under stimulus control to self-control is for me the central question where philosophy, psychiatry, psychology come together.
And a perfect segue to David, behavioral economics too. So you come at this probably from a field, furthest from everyone else on this panel. So when you think of self-control, do you see it targeting these phenomena as well?
Yeah, I do feel very aligned with this way of thinking about it. In answering your question, let me tell a story. I was, just before coming here in the hotel room, packing my bags, and CNN was on, and the Pistorius trial was being covered. This is the runner in South Africa who is accused of murdering his girlfriend. And let's assume, for the purposes of this conversation, as most people do believe, that he's guilty. And let me tell the story of self-control through the lens of that, of this episode. So I want to talk about 4 mechanisms, and you'll see the economics becoming more and more relevant as we move through the 4. So the first mechanism is exactly the negative, or some kind of motivation that is powerful, that is impulsive, that feels like not part of your true self, that in this case says, I want to murder this person. I hate them so much. I want to hurt them. I want to do something that seems out of sync with my general notion of what I'm trying to achieve in life. So there's the impulse, and the power of that impulse is an aspect of a lack of self-control. Then there's the inhibition, the reaction in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or wherever we want to think about it being associated neurally, or whether we want to think about it more abstractly. There is the inhibition that says, no, that's not what you really want. That is not your true self. That is not in your best interest. That violates principles don't do that. Then there's a third category, which is whether or not the individual had the self-knowledge to anticipate these moments. And the individual with self-knowledge doesn't keep a gun under their bed because they know that there are moments of rage. The individual with self-knowledge doesn't put, quarts of ice cream in the freezer because they know there are moments when that ice cream is abused. And I don't want to, trivialize murder by comparing it to eating ice cream, but there's an aspect of a recognition that these moments come, and if the person has this meta-knowledge, that creates a kind of self-control because it prevents them from acting out in these moments of rage or these moments of weakness of will, or whatever we want to call it. And then there's a fourth ingredient of self-control, which is the societal parameters that determine whether we are able to act on these impulses. So for example, in Massachusetts, where I live, there are very strict gun laws. And unless you try very hard, you can't have a gun under your bed. And in that case, even if I had rage, even if I couldn't inhibit the rage, even if I hadn't anticipated this and wanted a gun under my bed for other reasons, I couldn't have one. So I would have self-control in Massachusetts, despite all of those disadvantages, because I'm in an environment that facilitates self-control. And so I think we need to think about self-control through these four different channels: the power of the motivational states that sometimes derail us, our capacity to inhibit those motivational states, our self-knowledge that enables us to commit in ways to not act on those motivational states by limiting our choices, by not having guns under our beds, and the environments that we don't control but others control that influence our ability to destroy our lives or to even limit our lives by acting on these impulses to our own self-detriment.
Well, I could have sworn you were a cognitive neuroscientist in the way you've just broken down self-control, actually, and I actually caught some smiles on these guys, micro-expressions. So let me turn now. This is all great, I think, and very compatible, but John, you've spent some time doing cognitive neuroscience work in your career, I think. And so for those of you who don't know John, he is deeply embedded in the cognitive neuroscience world. Are there any other component parts that you think are central to this construct that you'd like to add on to what David described, or do you disagree fundamentally, and if so, even better? So please.
No, actually what I want to do is to broaden the discussion, if anything. The kind of self-control that Walter talked about yesterday, that David was just talking about, that Chandra mentioned in the examples that he gave about mood and affect control, all have to do with motivational states, appetitive states. That's where the cookies and the drugs and the sex come in. But when you look carefully at the literature on self-control writ large, what you find is that there's a much broader interest in mechanisms of self-control that go well beyond the appetitive states. So I'll give you a simple example. I apologize, it's a provincial example because it's taken from my laboratory, but I think it makes the point. One of the tasks that we've studied extensively in the last few years is how well people are able to control, self-control, the contents of their memory. So we give them a task in which we enter some information into their memory, maybe 4 words that they have to remember, and then we ask them to forget 2 of the words, volitionally forget 2 of the words. These words are neutral, words like desk and table and pen. We ask them to forget 2 of the words, and then we probe them with a probe and ask them, is this one of the words that you still have in memory? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes it's a word that they were told to forget. So the correct answer is no. They should say no to this word because they're not supposed to have that in memory any longer. And they have a harder time resisting the temptation to say yes to the words that they previously had in memory. So healthy individuals with material that's not affectively laden, completely neutral material, themselves have difficulty in controlling the contents of memory. So here's an example of a task where self-control goes well beyond appetitive stimuli, and yet you can see that even in a task as simple as this, you can find nuances to the task that make contact with the motivational states that we've been talking about. So I'll expand on the example. A few years ago, we studied a group, actually Ethan was involved in this work as well, we studied a group of clinically depressed individuals compared to demographically matched healthy controls. And we asked, do they have a harder time ridding their memories of information in the kind of task that I just described to you? The answer was no. They're just like healthy individuals, with one proviso. If the information that you ask them to get out of memory is negative in quality, words like, in the case of words, we've done it with other stimuli as well, in the case of words, words like kill or rape, murder, to get back to the Pistorius trial, depressed individuals, clinically depressed individuals, have a selectively harder time ridding their memories of that kind of negatively laden information. So you can look microscopically, I think, at this issue of self-control, as well as looking more broadly in the ways that David described, the 4 levels of analysis that David described. You can look even one level down and now ask, is self-control fundamentally written into the neural hardware in a way that goes beyond appetitive stimuli and includes all kinds of cognitive processes? And that's the sort of thing that the cognitive literature is loaded with. Whole bunches of studies of that sort.
You know, in some ways, since I was able to choose the questions, I chose a leading one in many ways because I'm very happy where this has gone. I think one of the take-home points from this first question is that self-control is much broader than cookies, sex, and drugs. It is shocking to me when looking in our field, though, when you go to conferences and you go to self-control symposia, how restricted some of those symposia, some of those handbook chapters are. And what I think that does is it prevents the kind of crosstalk that we're getting at here, right? Bringing in work from cognitive neuroscience, from behavioral economics, that deal fundamentally with this capacity to control the self, right? When I ask people who subscribe to the cookies, sex, and drugs theory of self-control, it's not a real theory, but it's a lay theory, I say, well, what is, when you have anger, or when you experience depression or anxiety, and you try to control that, is that not controlling the self, by definition? And so, I think if we adopt a broader view of this really important construct, we have the capacity to bring together people who are approaching it, although they may not be using that exact label in ways that could be really fruitful for deepening our conception of how this works and potentially how it can be altered.
Wait, so may I insert myself here?
Please.
So, a little personal history. I've spent my years, as Ethan said, as a cognitive neuroscientist, looking at these microscopic level analyses of cognitive processes, in particular the kind of self-control that I just described. Years ago, by now many years ago, a former colleague of mine, and sadly a former colleague of Walter's thereafter, Ed Smith. By the way, I want to correct the introduction. I used to be the Daniel J. Weintraub Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience. My current title is the Edward E. Smith Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience. I'm Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience. And I changed that. This is a singular event. The university has never done this. But in response to a request from me after Ed Smith passed away, he was a very close colleague of mine, very close colleague of Walter's. I asked the university to change my title, and they kindly did that. In any case, years ago, Ed Smith, who moved from Michigan to Columbia, and with whom I was still collaborating closely, I was interested in broadening the kind of self-control that I had been studying. And Ed and I had a conversation, and he said, I want to put you together with Walter Mischel, because it's exactly the kind of connection that's going to allow us to allow you to do exactly what Ethan is just now bringing up, broadening the landscape so that you can look from the most microscopic to the most molar level of analysis at this common concept of self-control. And that's when I started working with Walter on issues having to do with delay of gratification, and also recently working with Ethan on issues having to do with control of affect through other kinds of distancing mechanisms that Ethan has become famous for studying. And I think the beauty of marrying the kind of analysis that I do in my laboratory, my day job, with the kind of work that Walter does and the kind of work that Ethan does is that it allows me to bring my tasks to them and them to bring these conceptions of things like appetitive control to an understanding where we might be able to look at some of the neural mechanisms. And so, for example, Walter and I and a cast of thousands, it's surely thousands by now, right, Walter? Have studied high delayers and low delayers. Walter mentioned this yesterday in his talk. We flew them to Stanford and examined them in a couple of tasks in the scanner, one of which was the task that I just described to you, having people get information out of short-term memory. I think that kind of marriage of the work that I've done and the work that Walter has done never would have happened unless we had kind of broadened the conception.
And at least from my standpoint, which is quite a bit more junior than the two of you, it's this kind of integration that I think is certainly the most exciting kind of work that I'm involved in. And I think the way in which we have to go if we really want to make further leaps into our understanding of self-control.
Can I add something about, it is fascinating that the different kinds of control, appetitive control, cognitive control over working memory, or control over habit, or control over negative emotion, they all have some unities, and lying behind there is worth getting out in the open, is a presupposition of how the underlying architecture is set up. And in all these cases, in order to make sense of self-control, you have to postulate some sort of bifurcation. So there has to be a component that behaves somewhat independent. There have to be at least two independent components. You can't make sense of self-control with just one system standing outside and controlling itself. And so there's always a kind of intuitive, fast, automatic, spontaneous system, and something that is a bit slower, more serial, and more reflective. That kind of architecture is always present, and the reflective, slower system has some sort of operation in which it can put the brakes on, halt, suppress, or otherwise attenuate the quick system. And whether we're talking about working memory, where there's spontaneous attentional or memory phenomenon and some sort of reflective intervention, or habits, where there's kind of an automatic habit and then reflective control or motivation. It's not just that the control or the inhibition is similar, but the underlying architectures that give rise to it in all these domains seem to be really similar. And that's a deep principle about how the human mind is set up. Again and again, we see the contrast between reflective and intuitive. And hopefully we'll get a chance to say a little bit later why that kind of architecture exists and which system is better. The answer is neither. But that this kind of architecture lurks in the background. Really interesting idea, and a fertile one if we pursue it.
If I can react to that,
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more strongly, and that's why I talked yesterday briefly about a hot system and a cool system, and why I think that the idea of two systems is useful, certainly, in the study of self-regulation. Many of us, especially as we learn through our colleagues a bit more about neuroscience, get nervous about talking about two systems, because my understanding, at least, is that really good neuroscientists say, what is this two-system talk? You got one brain, it's constantly interacting, and so on. So that even my friend and colleague Danny Kahneman, writing Thinking Fast and Slow, felt obliged to make these fictional characters in a story and keep saying it's just a metaphor. It's just a metaphor. I don't really mean it. It's just a story. But I really mean it. I think you got to have, just as you're saying, a two-system conception, because I think it allows us to make good sense of Aristotle, in a way that one couldn't at the time that he was talking. And that this is really where an understanding of how attention control works and how the brain works becomes essential for us to move from sort of molecular tiny studies that look fine in the literature, but that don't speak to these larger issues that are being raised about how does one obtain freedom to become the self one wants to become, rather than being victimized by being under stimulus control. And I think this favorite phrase of the behaviorists, stimulus control, is really what the attempts at self-control are directed against. Now, some of the time we're inevitably under stimulus control and so on. And that's, I think, at some point we'll probably be talking, I hope, with David's help, about nudging and the interesting things that are being done by economists and others in behavioral economics about nudging. From my point of view, when we turn to the question of training and how do you learn it and how do you convey this to your kids, or how can we get this into preschool programs that are being talked about that are really informed by the research rather than, by the benign intention, good intentions of the teachers, has to hook up with the conversation that we're having now, because what David was referring to as the third mechanism, or the third aspect of it, is exactly how the training efforts can begin to get a mechanism going where the control of affect and of negative affect becomes part of self-control by systematically slowing the heart system long enough for the thoughtful brain to get into the story.
Since
May-
we...
oh.
Please.
So, as a neuroscientist, I'm going to speak for the neuroscience community. So Walter yesterday mentioned the hot system and the cool system. David brought up this distinction between impulses and inhibition. Chandra brought up this idea of a kind of reward-driven system and then an inhibitory system that drives it down. And Walter says neuroscientists don't think that way. They don't think in terms of two systems. Well, here's one who does. In fact, the leading theory of adolescence these days is that there is a reward system and a reward system largely in the limbic system, as Walter brought up yesterday, and a prefrontal control system that drives down those rewards that develops much later because myelinization isn't complete in prefrontal cortex until maybe the early 20s, and that's why teenagers get themselves into trouble. Cookies, sex, and drugs. And so here's a case where even the neural data suggests that there's plausibility to this idea of two systems, even in the context of one brain.
So let's just go, I think, while we're on the topic of two systems. I think there's a missing piece here that we haven't yet talked about, because we've been talking about the two systems in terms of the hot one goes up, the cool system, the reflective system, system 2, can be activated to turn down the hot system. Is it possible for other kinds of interactions between the two systems, for example, using the capacity to reflect, to think about our lives, to amplify and bring up the hot system? Anyone want to chime in on that? So in other words, is it possible through conscious, reflective deliberation to amplify your emotional responses and put in more crude terms, make yourself crazy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the work that Walter reviewed yesterday shows us when we're exposed, when we intend to expose ourselves and expose ourselves to the cues that are associated with amplifying the hot system, that's exactly what happens. We give that system greater voice. I can expose the rewards, I can hide the rewards, I can think about the rewards as things I'm going to eat, or I can think about the rewards as abstract colors and forms and shapes. Are marshmallows food, or are marshmallows clouds? And the more that we use system 2, this higher order system, this more abstract system, to reorient our representations towards the hot representations, I think the more we empower the voice of the hot system and ultimately likely lead those motives to dominate our actions.
Well, if I can chirp into that, I think that fundamental for many issues of self-control is to overcome the central concept, I think, in the kind of work that David does, which is discounting, temporal discounting, because it's the lack of it's the temporal discounting that gets totally smart people to do totally stupid things. So that when we read regularly about the fallen celebrities and the fallen heroes, whether it's Tiger Woods or Judge Wackler, a particular tragic story in New York State, were the model of judicial prudence and wisdom, who really made some of the most wonderful decisions that influenced marital rape and so on, court decisions, wound up himself rejected by his mistress and engaging in completely cuckoo behavior with her and threatening her through her teenage daughter and so on, and wound up in handcuffs in his own court. I mean, these kinds of regular tragedies that occur because the smartest people in the world still have a hell of a problem visualizing in hot terms the delayed consequences, that is the imminent pressure and power of what this guy was feeling was sufficient to overcome the enormity of what he did to himself. And so much of what goes into tragedies from the Grecian drama on is the failure to represent in sufficiently affectively laden terms the stuff that's stripped of affect by the brain because it's in the future. So who cares? And the fact is the hot system doesn't give a damn about delayed consequences. From an evolutionary point of view, that was great because you didn't need delayed consequences when you were living under jungle conditions. You wanted to survive. You needed to know where's the food and what can you eat and what's going to eat you. So it made great sense to have hot system dominance. But to live in our kind of society, unless the hot is applied to the distal consequences, which we're not yet, our brains are not at the point, I think, where we are able to represent in easy, natural ways delayed consequences. It's an unnatural thing. Even for people who are pretty good at it, it's an unnatural thing. I think it's time to get into personal anecdotes. So let me tell you the story of how I, who am, as Ethan and all my other students can testify, not particularly good at self-control. I mean, I would ask my students in the evening to do a data analysis and call them at 2 in the morning to see how it went. So this is kind of a, you know,
it's a common occurrence.
Right, it's a level of impatience, really, that you wouldn't. So how did I get over being a 3-pack a day, supplemented by cigars at the right occasions and a pipe in 1962 when the Surgeon General's report came out? So I saw the Surgeon General's report. I was very impressed by it, and I proceeded to completely forget it. You know, it made absolutely no difference until I had an epiphany moment. And the epiphany moment was I was taking a shower, and I realized that I was in the shower while my pipe was still in my mouth. This was a remarkably strong experience because it required me to change the conception of myself as basically sort of like an Oxford Don kind of person, and that I was doing what everybody else was doing at the time anyway, and so what. Except that soon after the shower, I happened to be wandering in the halls of the Stanford Medical School, visiting my wife, who was having a baby, but she was in the cancer ward because the other wards were filled. So I had the pleasure of seeing a poor guy being wheeled in a gurney with his chest exposed, his head shaved, and little green marks all over, his arms outstretched. It looked almost like a crucifixion scene. And in horror, I asked the nurse, what's going on here? And she said, oh, he's got metastasized cancer, and those little marks are where the radiation goes. That was the moment, because this gave me the hot image that I needed I could see myself on the gurney. I could imagine the doctor showing me the x-ray. I had the vivid representation, and I used it. And it was a cinch to get over it. It was a cinch to get over it, particularly when it included also making a contract with my then 3-year-old daughter. She stopped sucking her thumb, and I stopped sucking my pipe, and so on. And other sort of pre-commitment plans, so that when I desperately tried to mooch cigarettes from everybody else who was smoking, they would refuse me, etc. So I'm just giving this as a concrete instance to how someone who has to struggle with self-control issues can do it if you can get to the hot representation of the distal consequence.
Well, it's everything. It's the hot representation, and it's the commitment, and it's the social support. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
all of it.
We use them all.
That's the
And so
package.
I think this is an important point, though. Is this working? No. I think this is a really important point because when we think about two systems, I think many people reflexively think that cool is always one that turns the hot system down. System 1, system 2 interactions. And yet the conversation suggests, and I think, is this working?
Yeah.
And I think the reality of your story, Walter, suggests that there are cases in which you can use this control cool system to modulate the more primitive hot one in either direction. And I think that is an important point to be aware of when thinking about how the architecture supports the software that guides our lives.
But there's another point to be taken from Walter's anecdote, which I think is, Walter's anecdote is very poignant. What it highlights is that it took a hot version of the long-term consequences to wake Walter up about the dangers of smoking. But it could have happened differently. It could have happened to Bill Clinton differently, as Walter was telling anecdotes yesterday. It could have happened to Elliot Spitzer differently. It could have happened to the judge you were just talking about differently. And the way it could have happened is if they could have mentally simulated what the long-term consequences are, even without seeing the patient on the gurney. If Walter could have mentally simulated 10, 20, 30 years hence when he went to see the doctor and the news was bad, if Elliot Spitzer could have mentally simulated what the New York Times story was going to be when he got caught spending thousands of dollars on prostitutes, maybe at that point that mental simulation might have changed the short-term behavior.
And that mental simulation process that you're describing, taken to an extreme, I'd argue is clinical levels of anxiety. Simulating the fearful event in the future that could derail you, using your cognitive apparatus to mentally simulate, right, and amplify these fears. What will happen if I'm caught, and so forth and so on. So the interactions, the dance between the two systems can be quite complicated, and figuring it out is an important one.
I think that's right. I think that there's a lot of unity here, that there is a hot system and there's a cool system, but where there may be some emerging disagreement is in the characterization as one is hero and the other is villain, necessarily.
Yes.
It's really important to point out that rather than thinking of a relation of one is the smart system and the other one is the dumb one that needs to be subdued, there could be a picture that's much more nuanced and complicated. I think, and this is an emerging understanding that I've been trying to come at the last few years, especially with the help of my colleague Peter Railton, who's convinced me many times that we should think of the hot system as having its own toolkit and pattern of strengths and weaknesses, and the cool system as well as having its own profile of strengths and weaknesses. And one thing the hot system is really good at that we haven't emphasized, it's a great pattern recognizer. And there's all sorts of cognitive neuroscience and behavioral data about how if you present very complex probabilistic sequences in the environment, a person can use their hot system, their intuitive system, to intuitively detect the statistical contingencies way before the cool system can articulate what's going on, suggesting that the hot system is not dumb and crude, but it has its own way of interacting with the environment and its own profile of strengths and weaknesses. And the cool system, as you've just pointed out, it can use its interrupt function too much and generate ruminative reliving of counterfactual scenarios, which is not healthy either. And so, the same point that you made, it would be useful to think in terms of the dance and the interplay of two systems with their own profiles of strengths and weaknesses.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, and to me, the hot system is everything but a dumb system. It's a very smart survival system. I mean, without the hot system, we really wouldn't live very long. It's the system that on a conditioning basis and on associative learning keeps us going and keeps us moving and keeps us surviving.
But that's faint praise. That's faint praise, because what it's saying is, yeah, we need these crude reflexes in order to survive, but they are crude nonetheless. Whereas,
well, I mean, they're basic. I mean, I'd rather say basic than crude. I think, to me, there's nothing crude about the fact that if we heard a bullet shot now, we'd all be diving for cover. And that's a very wonderful mechanism because it might help us survive. So to me, the hot, and the wonderful thing, though, in terms of the interaction between hot and cool systems when it's adaptive, is that I think we can actually harness the hot system to do the instantaneous recognition for us of the ifs. What are the ifs? To me, the ifs are the hot spots that are the hot spots for Bill Clinton, for Walter Mischel, for the judge, and so on. To know that from the cool system, those are my hot ifs. And when my hot system triggers them, that's when I've got an automatic scenario that kicks into place that the hot system has waiting for me and is doing. So it's not the cool system that's saving me, it's the hot system that's saving me from doing really crazy things, because I have managed to teach it when you're tempted to, when as I still do in Paris, where I spend a lot of time when I can, occasionally seat myself outside, which is a complete smoking area, whereas inside, you can't smoke anymore in Paris. So I occasionally still find myself, for wonderful excuses, that I'd like to sit out there and just inhale. So nothing is a complete cure. Then after a while, you've had your few whiffs, and you go back into the healthy environment. But I think really, if and when we turn to questions of training and of really helping people who have huge executive function problems, and I'm thinking about our South Bronx data. I'm thinking about not the privileged Stanford kids where lower educational level is just going to Yale,
Well, I think there seems.
Could I add a comment here too? Because I think we all agree that the hot system has enormous capabilities.
No one is volunteering to have their amygdala removed.
Exactly. But I think about 5,000 years ago, where the cool system had less scope to be contributory to individuals' lives, versus today, where the cool system is engaged in far, far more opportunities. So for example, you take a student and you teach the student beta hat equals x prime x inverse x prime y. All of that abstraction is an extraordinary technological advance over a few millennia, and presumably our ability to take novel, abstract information, learn how to process it, turn it into wisdom, apply it to our lives. This is an extraordinary set of arrangements that the cool system is now able to take advantage of. So while I agree both systems are absolutely critical, and in some ways the hot system is more sophisticated than the cool system, there has been, over the course of millennia, more and more opportunity for the cool system to contribute. And I think, and I wonder, this is now a wildly speculative observation, that if these systems were calibrated correctly by evolution in terms of their balance, as the resources that the cool system can use, abstract tools, education, mathematical formulation, all sorts of symbolic languages, etc. As that world of resources gets bigger, perhaps the evolutionarily adaptive calibration of the two systems' weights has now become a miscalibration, and in fact we're overweighting the hot system, or at least using evolution's weighting, we're overweighting the hot system because the cool system today has more at its disposal, but it's not being used, and then we end up with, the Pistoriuses of the modern world.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a great question, and when you were speaking, I was thinking, would it be possible to determine an optimal weighting of the two systems, and how might that vary for people? And I don't think we have answers to that question yet.
I don't even know if weighting is the right metaphor. There is a way in which I've been convinced, and again in engagement with my colleagues, that ultimately what the cool system does is it helps the hot system do its job better. I mean, when we talk about, this is a great example from Walter, that is, when we respond effectively to delayed consequences, what we're doing is putting a vivid, more concrete, fully fleshed out representation before the hot system so it can feast its affective responses on that. So it's not a weighting in which here we're using the cool system. It's the cool system is helping the hot system do its job better. And in general, I think that's a very general phenomenon. And I'll pick an example from philosophy. Because philosophers are supposed to be, these reflective armchair thinkers that are engaging with abstract principles. But if you look at the day-to-day work of what philosophers do, they put forward these abstract principles. Like they'll say, for a theory of what is morally right, it's the greatest good for the greatest number. It sounds like an effective or a reasonable principle, but nobody can really evaluate that until you turn it into a concrete case and allow your intuitive response to feast on that case itself. That is, a lot of what philosophy does is presents kind of concrete cases and see whether it's intuitive and check your intuitions against other kinds of cases, and you try to generate some sort of coherence. It's as, even if the most reflective field, it just can't operate on cool system reasoning by itself. It's the cool system, maybe coming up with principles, but ultimately putting concrete, vivid cases before the hot system and seeing how the hot system responds. So I think that's a very general pattern. It's not a weighting of the cool and the hot, it's the hot interacting better and better with the cool interacting better and better with the hot, helping the hot see things more clearly and do its job better.
As you're speaking, I was thinking of the film that I showed yesterday of the kids.
Yeah.
You don't see a hot and a cool separate. You see a continuous interaction between the two as they're approaching the treat and stopping themselves. They're going to the bell and then turning it into a game. They're realizing really without a lot of thinking that I've got to get this thing away from me, and then turning that into a as long a distractor as they possibly can. So I think it's for me, what we saw in those films really illustrates what executive function is and how smooth the connections are between these two systems. And that it helps us when we talk about it to talk about two systems. But in terms of how the thing is working, it's not like one has gone to sleep and the other one has taken over. They're in constant conversation.
Yeah. You should feel free to act as the traffic cop on this comment, because I don't want to derail the progress of the conversation.
Usually, John, when you start that statement, does not go there. If you like, go ahead.
Give it a shot.
I want to be sure that you all understand, as I'm sure we all understand, that what's being termed here as two systems may actually have multiple versions of them. So what we've been talking about is the hot system, which David refers to as impulses, for example, when he was giving the Pistorius example, may be different from the kind of implicit learning system that Chandra was talking about when he was talking about sensitivity to probabilistic a variation in the environment around us, and which he later talked about as an intuitive system in reflecting about concrete cases that might be test cases to come up with counterexamples for some philosophical principle.
Yeah.
So the intuitive and the implicitly learned and the impulsive may not all be the same system.
No, I think that's actually a great point to clarify, because we are the boundaries between some of these constructs are getting blurred, and I think that's okay. But having some check on that is important. So thank you.
So if I can expand the conversation a bit, I think that to give a discussion of self-control a more complete, fair rendering, it's important to realize that some of the qualities that are correlated with high self-control, and that, at least in my head, help to explain the correlations. You know, why would being able to wait more seconds predict stuff when they're 13 and 14 years old? You know, why is it that even if you do whatever you can to take out the effect of, quote, intelligence, that you still find that the kids who are waiting longer have a lot better SAT scores 10 years after they're done with the cookies? So I think there's a set of resources, is what they're called in psychology, but I think really a better way is to refer to them as the enviable beliefs. There's a set of enviable beliefs that are very important, that go with the ability to exert self-control and self-regulation. Mm-hmm. And they come down to the kinds of things that Carol Dweck talks about, and Al Bandura has talked about as a sense of self-efficacy, or a sense of I think I can, a belief that I am an efficacious, effective human being, which in turn tends to go with optimism or positive expectations. And like everything in life, these wonderful, enviable beliefs have a downside. And the downside of them is that the optimists not only get the Rhodes Scholarships, but in time they develop a sense that they're immune, and that they really are, you know, all set and all fine, and that there aren't any vulnerabilities there. So they're not particularly interested in taking seminars in self-control. They're off to do whatever they're doing. And the downside in which I think they get caught is that excessive optimism, and this is very well discussed in Kahneman's book, and I agree with John that really when Kahneman talks about fast and slow, he's talking about stuff that's correlated with hot and cool, but it's by no means the same. He's talking about really quite, his story is a different story. So I think that the traps for the judges and so on is the conviction that goes with good self-control and with success beginning early in life, and that helps kids who are good at this to do well at school and so on. The downside is they become excessively optimistic, and that they have an excess of something that we've all got, no matter how good or bad we are at self-control, which is a psychological immune system. And I think the reality of the psychological immune system is as great as the reality of the biological immune system, and in fact, the two interact with each other all the time. And the psychological immune system tells you that you may very well make all the mistakes that Kahneman's book is about, you know, because we are programmed to easily make those mistakes. But don't worry about it, because in time, you'll forget it and feel good about yourself anyway. So the psychological immune system is very good to have, but it also creates vulnerability. So I'm just suggesting hot and cool is part of the story, but if we're talking about the whole story, we also have to go with the associated beliefs, because I think it's entirely possible for people, for example, to have excellent executive function and no passion, no motivation, and to be hugely competent and completely aimless and adrift. So if we're going now from, waiting for cookies at age 4 to how lives play out, I think we can't do it well unless we enlarge the story.
So Walter got us started with some personal stories, so I'll share one with you. Last night I went to bed and I said to my wife, I wonder if we're going to be able to sustain this conversation for the full time period. Clearly this is not an issue because we have gotten through one question out of the 16. So thank you guys for doing so well. So let me begin to transition to our second piece, which is fundamentally about whether this capacity for self-control can be enhanced. And to do so, I want to stick a little while longer with one basic question, which taps into the question of nature versus nurture, which Walter talked a little bit about yesterday during his talk. Here the question is, how much can self-control actually be nurtured through one's environment, through one's learning experiences and so forth? Do those experiences not only influence us on this environmental factor, but can they influence our biology? And to lead us on those questions, I thought I would steer to John and Dave to get us started, because John, you've done some work in the domain of neuroplasticity and training, and have a little bit to say on that potentially. And David, I think there may be programs out there at various stages. People are thinking about how to do this on a broad scale, and so I'd be curious to hear what either of you have to say about this nature versus nurture issue to get us started on this topic.
So let me begin with the worst news. There is a large literature having to do with training all sorts of things, largely having to do with cognitive skills, but all sorts of things. I'm familiar with much of this literature. I'm sure you all have read much of this literature. On my reading, to a first approximation, what this literature says is that if you train a skill, it won't transfer to anything else. That is, training is all specific. It's specific to the skill that you've acquired in whatever the training program is. Now, the research that I'm doing in another part of my life has to do with cognitive training of higher level cognitive skills, things like fluid intelligence. And we have evidence that you can train one skill and it will transfer to fluid intelligence. But it's extremely controversial. I mean, mine is not the only opinion that appears in the literature. There are others on the other side of the issue. And so I think still to a first approximation, the thing that worries me most when we talk about training, delay of gratification in this case, is the efficacy of any training program for developing a skill that will transfer to other things. So if you train people not to eat cookies, will that help them not smoke later on?
Okay, if I can chip in here.
Time out. The fact that my advisor is asking me permission for him to speak is so gratifying right now. I cannot describe it.
I think that I think the desire, the hope for generalization effects is probably unjustified, and we don't need it. And the reason we don't need it is because I think it relates to a conception of who we are that I don't think is justified by the data. What I'm referring to in these rather sweeping statements is that it suggests that we are made up of broad traits, and that these broad traits, how do we penetrate them? Is there a training that can create different traits in us, that can change our traits? I've got data that I'd like to show at some point, not right now, but it's from Wedico, and it's designed to go to another question, I think, of profound importance for philosophy, which is the nature of character structure. That is, do we have a character? And if so, what is it? the data I want to talk about is the specificity of our hotspots. I'll refer to a particular study that Yuichi Shoda, my colleague, did recently. And what Yuichi did was to study groups that are coming in for psychotherapy and assessment and so on at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he works. And he did an if-then analysis of their stress signatures. That is, they were all suffering from stress. And what he did was a hugely careful study, monitoring study, of when do they actually experience stress? What are the ifs that are triggering stress? And what he found was that the people who are suffering from stress and who are on average have high stress levels actually don't have stress most of the time. They have stress when certain hotspots are activated. The hotspots for this particular memorable case, Jenny, let's call her, was when she felt personally excluded, when she felt rejected. And so her feelings about rejection were very, very crystallized. They were connected to certain kinds of things that happened to her that triggered this. So I think on close analysis, in the same way, those kids at Wadiko who are there because they have huge problems of predisposition to aggression, when you look at kids, Anthony and Jimmy in the slide that I'll show later, they have the same overall level of aggression. So from a trait point of view, the idea would be we've got to train them somehow to be less aggressive. When you look actually at, with 189 hours of observation of each child on average, at where is Jimmy's problems with aggression and where are Anthony's problems of aggression, and you see that with the same mean trait level, you have two completely different children. Two completely different minds are going here, in which what is driving one wild, is almost the opposite of what is driving the other wild. So therefore, any attempt to train, to do therapy, to do assessment, it seems to me, needs to be structured highly specifically, needs to be contextualized in an understanding of how your hotspots are different from my hotspots.
Which is a potentially labor-intensive approach to intervention, which contradicts what many people may want, which is the quick fix or computer app that they, every 2 seconds, work on to train their self-control. Not that one exists, but these are goals that people have. We see this in the weight loss industry. And is that a misguided view, that you can bolster your self-control with a simple training intervention that's not personalized in some way?
Yeah, it's misguided now. Let me think about this whole intervention through three different lenses. One is, does it generalize? And I agree that the evidence so far is pretty depressing. We're all looking for generalization opportunities, and there are very, very few. I'm eager to read the paper that you mentioned. Another is, does it persist? And another source of depressing news is that a lot of the interventions work for a short period of time, hours, days, months, and then you quickly fade after that right back to baseline. But a third way to think about it is the intervention cost effective? And there I think there's more promise, which is even if it doesn't generalize, or if the generalization is weak, the spillovers can be weak, even if it doesn't persist, so that we get an improvement of behavior for months or a few years, but not when they transfer into adulthood. Like most things, we might contemplate booster shots. We might contemplate inexpensive investments that last for a short period of time, but the cost is low enough that the benefits swamp the costs. And so, though I'm also depressed by all of these negative results, the lack of generalization, the lack of persistence, I'm still optimistic about the general program of improving people's self-regulation through cost-effective interventions that are inexpensive enough that we don't mind doing it despite their lack of the lack of potency.
May I jump in here? Because David has brought up two absolutely critical issues, the issue of generalization, which I talked about before, and the issue of persistence. I want to refer everybody here on the panel and everybody in the audience to what I think is the single most impressive example of a training intervention that I know of in the literature. The study was sponsored and largely run by NIH. The acronym is ACTIVE. That stands for something, and I don't remember what the something is that it stands for. And what it is an attempt to train older adults' selective cognitive capacities. So there's a reasoning training group, there's a memory training group, there's a cognitive speed training group. I think those are the three, and then there's a control group. And the most impressive thing to me about the study, which just appeared very recently in Science or Nature or Psychological Science, one of the flagship journals, the most impressive thing is that they followed these individuals 10 years out, retesting them, much like Walter followed the high and low delayers, not for as long a period as Walter followed them, but at least 10 years out, which is a very impressive period of time. And they discovered persistence. If you're trained on reasoning skills, you're better at reasoning 10 years later. Now that's already impressive, but here's the most impressive part. They were only trained for 1 month in the beginning of the intervention and no intervention thereafter. No booster shots, nothing. 10 years later, if you're trained on reasoning, you're better at reasoning. 10 years later, if you're trained on memory, you're better on memory. 10 years later, if you're trained on speed, you're better on speed. So as depressed as I am about generalization, I'm heartened, I'm enthused, I'm excited about the possibility that they may be specific what we train, but at least some of them will last for a period of
That
time.
study's not the representative study.
It's not, unfortunately, it's not the representative
that's
study.
very,
I know.
That's the exceptional result.
I agree.
99 out of 100 show a year later you're back to baseline.
Yep.
Now, I think we should take that study to heart, and maybe they did something that we can use in other settings. But I do want everyone to know that, by and large, persistence is almost never present.
No, I mean, I want to get into this also. I think the thinking on this topic, I'm the one in the group who was trained in clinical psychology, so I started, with the idea that, for example, particular problems like speech stammers or twitches or phobias, that you have to go back to early childhood and the rest of it, and you have to kind of rework the personality. And for years, for someone who began this kind of work in the 50s, the idea was that if you're tinkering with a problem by trying to remove it, you're going to create terrible damage because you'll run into symptom substitution. So for anyone trained in clinical psychology, the idea that you're going to remove a speech stammer, for example, in the way that happened to the King of England in the movie that was so popular, The King's Speech, that this will really create a big mess for the person because worse problems will come in substitute for it. Well, Al Bandura and I were, fighting this problem for 20 years at Stanford, and it wasn't until cognitive behavior therapy got started with the recognition that actually you can change specific problems and that you will have positive generalization effects, if anything, and not negative ones. So that and there are lots of studies done in cognitive behavior therapy that show that when you remove a particular problem, you improve the person, they feel better, and that you get generalized effects because their lives are better. So that the king, the guy who became King of England without the speech stammer was a much better person because he didn't have the stammer anymore and he didn't have this huge embarrassment to deal with. So I think there's a lesson to be learned from that in how we think about change, that you don't necessarily have to go and try to restructure the whole story. You can work with very specific effects which take on a life of their own when they're really well taken care of. And I'm thinking now of other studies, particularly with young kids in preschool. I'm thinking of Adele Diamond's studies published in Science magazine that suggest that her Tools of the Mind curriculum make an enormous difference to how well kids can learn executive function in preschool with exactly the populations that need it most. Kids who are living in deeply impoverished, terribly troublesome, terribly stressful environments. It works. In a much even more wisely and fully controlled set of studies, Mike Posner at Oregon has clearly shown that with computer games and so on, you can teach kids executive function with simple things like using a joystick to help a cat, to stay on dry territory while the water and the mud is increasing all around the pussycat. Or you can help the cat stay dry because you're able, with the joystick, to move the umbrella so that it keeps up with the cat, keeps the cat dry. Those kids actually, from 5 sessions and with repeated follow-ups over a month or 2 or 3, not very long, increased their IQ points. So I think that when it comes to targeted interventions that are not trying to change big traits, but that are trying to change very specific skills, it's not a discouraging picture to me.
Well, let me jump in here. The way I'm encoding this conversation is that we're really talking about 2 categories of interventions. There are the computer games, if you will. So there are these games that off the shelf, everyone does the same kind of training in memory, or you name the component of executive function. But then there's the therapeutic intervention, which is another form of intervention, CBT, cognitive therapy, which is a much more contextualized, idiographic approach. I don't know how well those 2 worlds are talking to each other right now. I know there is some work on training biases in the anxiety literature, but they're 2 potentially different ways of thinking about intervening. Do they fit together? Is there a way to meld them? Is one better for one type of person than the other? Should people do both kinds of interventions? Anyone have any thoughts about that?
We have a card-carrying psychiatrist here. I'd be interested to hear his thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't have preformed thoughts. A couple of thoughts came to mind. One is that cognitive behavioral therapy, a really striking thing about it is the way that it targets the antecedents of the emotion generation process. So cognitive behavioral therapy, the thought is that individuals, the core case would be depression. These people have habitual, automatic negative thoughts. And what you're teaching the person to do is to recognize and challenge the beliefs that sustain the downstream negative emotions. And there's a really profound lesson there that the point of intervention where you actually need to deploy the self-control because you've got an active negative thought, full-fledged, a negative emotion, full-fledged, there that you have to then exert kind of effortful control over is much too distal in the process. And getting at the thoughts and the antecedent appraisals is where you have the most leverage and the ability to intervene and the most generalizability. Very early on is where you have kind of the point of intervention. That's one thought. And then the one other thing that I wanted to put on the table, and I don't know if you think this is quackery, John, but all the neurofeedback treatments that have emerged, especially for things like ADHD. So in addition to idiographic kind of therapeutic contexts and computer games, there's the thought that you can intervene at very more...
Maybe tell everyone what neurofeedback is.
Yeah, right. I can give an example. In the ADHD literature, this is really a kind of a hot area. There are ways to measure somebody's attentional state, for example, with EEG. And it sounds a little like hocus pocus, but actually, if you put an EEG, which is a kind of a non-invasive kind of skull cap, a bunch of leads on your head, you can measure the ratio of theta waves to beta waves. Theta waves are thought to reflect lack of attention, and beta waves reflect alert attentional states. And simply calculating a theta-beta ratio is thought, there's actually now an FDA test to diagnose ADHD using the theta-beta ratio. And another thing you can do, though, is you can hook kids up to an EEG machine and let them in real time look at their theta-beta ratio. And so you're getting not at the level of behavior, the thought is you're tapping into a very basic attention functioning parameter and letting the person get feedback in real time about that parameter and adjust it and improve it. And there are not enough studies to say that this is conclusively effective, but there's a lot of evidence that this might be effective. So that's another kind of point of intervention. If the goal here is to give people new means of affecting their kind of psychological parameters that underlie self-control, it may very well be that we have to go to the neurofeedback route in order to really get at the underlying springs and parameters that underlie self-control. And that's where you might get some persistence and generalizability.
I think also there's very encouraging news from some of the work on mindfulness training and meditation connected to mindfulness training, which seems to be a very effective way of teaching effective executive function. But the main point I wanted to make is that the work on the clown box, on plans that I talked about yesterday, on if-then plans for dealing with hot stimuli. Peter Gollwitzer and Gabrielle Oettingen at NYU have done really a remarkable series of studies, lots of them, that are being replicated by other people, to show that there are all kinds of relatively easy way that these if-then implementation plans can be taught for the specific ifs that matter to you or that matter to that person. So they're highly targeted. There's no attempt to change everything. There's an attempt to change the response to that if. And it's been used with ADHD kids. It's been used to control snacking in people who are struggling with obesity issues. So it's really, I think, a very encouraging way to think about a change, which is in highly contextualized ways with no expectation of generalization, just an attempt to get stable control over the particular hotspots that ideographically are problematic for that particular individual. I mean, that's the way, I think, for the future.
So the work that you just cited, Walter, and what Chandra was talking about when he was talking about CBT, all points to what Jerry Fodor once called the encapsulation of thought. That is, you have these capsules, these localized skills that you have, and if you want to change one of them, you better work on that one, because working on another one isn't going to help you with this.
Yeah, I mean, that quest for generalized effects, has been going on since the end of the 19th century, not the 20th century, and has been spectacularly unsuccessful. I mean, from my point of view, it's not the way to go. The way to go is with highly specific, targeted interventions that then have a chance of carrying, because without the stutter, you become a happier person. Without the twitch, you become a more effective person. Without the crazy phobia that you can't cross bridges anymore, you become a more effective salesman.
Although let me see if I can introduce another way of thinking about this, which leads me to the optimism that allows me to do the cognitive training work that I'm doing.
That's where I want you to go.
And I will send you that paper, by the way.
Yeah.
The idea that motivates our work is not that you can get generalization from training skill A onto skill B in any kind of generic way, but rather if you can find a way to decompose skill A so that you understand what its elements are, and if you can then train one of those essential elements, the issue then is, will you get generalization from that trained element to skill A? So in the case that we're working with, we're training short-term memory in a complicated way, and we find generalization to fluid intelligence. That's the paper that I'll send you. But that's a very different idea than training smoking cessation and having it transfer to
cookies.
Snacking.
Yeah.
Right.
Very different.
So you have to find the molecules
That's
of
exactly
the
right.
skills.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. So you have to find the molecules that are essential. It's a very nice way of putting it. You have to find the molecules, the elements, as I call them, that are the component elements for some skill. And then if you can train, and the hopeful thing is that that element doesn't only participate in this skill, it might participate in other skills as well. And so maybe there'll be some generalization to other skills just because there are these cognitive primitives that I hope drive a lot of our
Well,
behavior.
I think the idea of a molecular approach, both to training and therapy and as a prior to assessment is crucial. That we stop of thinking about people as just sort of being aggressive or having, X kind of weakness, including weakness of the will, and find out the molecular structure of, where are the problems really, where are the hot spots, and address those in a priority list. Now, the part that I think does require if one of the questions that Ethan sent to us is if you had 30 minutes with Obama, what would you say to him? I think if I had 30 minutes, what I would say to him is that this preschool idea is very important that he's been talking about, but it is extremely important for it to be more than nice preschool teachers, being nice to little kids so that they have a place to go and have a good time. And that what has been learned about executive function, what has been learned about self-control, about attention regulation, can, as personified in Adele Diamond's Tools of the Mind program, for example, or in some variation thereof, it can be translated into something that gives kids this, because there are fundamentally important issues of critical timing. If a kid is not prepared by the time she's 4, 5, 6 years old to inhibit interfering responses, to keep a goal in mind, and to use attention regulation sufficiently flexibly to stay with it, they're going to have an impossible time in school, in any serious school. And that, in turn, will create a pattern that makes getting out of the conditions that they need to get out of impossible, and that will... So it seems to me there are critical periods, that preschool is the time that's very important, that training executive function during those years is certainly what I would spend my 30 minutes on.
Well, let's run with that. So if you could intervene, if you could get into a school and build self-control into the curriculum, how would you do it?
A preschool or a...
Wherever you think it best to intervene, why don't you share that with everyone too? When would you intervene, and what, based on what you know, which we all know there are lots of question marks that still surround this construct, what would be your prescription for the best chance of enhancing self-control among society at this point? Or are you hesitant to even prescribe anything because you're concerned about it being potentially useless or dangerous? Anyone?
Well, if you...
well, hold on. Let's see, because I know your answer.
Yeah.
Let's see anyone else. And then you come in and you'll...
No, it's fine.
Anyone else?
Well, it's time to be adventurous. It's not time to be conservative. And it's quite clear from the evidence, some of which Walter cited yesterday, some of which Walter cited today, that developing a skill of self-control is at least as important as developing fundamental scholastic skills to predict later school performance. So should we intervene? Absolutely. Should we do it in an aggressive way? Absolutely, but we have to do it in a scientific way also where we can assess the outcomes. Now, question is, at what level should that happen? This is beyond my level of expertise, above my pay grade.
So there are lots of efforts, and I think we should let 1,000 flowers bloom here and study them all at every age range. And there's so many studies that are successful at different ages, and there are so many studies even more that are failures at every age level. So I'm very hesitant to pick out our favorite study and say, look, this succeeded, because for every success, we can pick out 30 other failures that should make us very nervous. So I believe that this should be a major investment. I'm happy to add that to the conversation with Obama, and thinking about how we build self-regulation, how we build it in the schools. What I would introduce, not because I think it's the most promising lever, but because I think it's one of the least explored, is that third category that I touched on with Pistorius, which is teaching people self-knowledge so they're in a better position to understand their own vulnerabilities. I mean, this is kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy, except now we're giving it to everyone, not to a particular group, saying to every 10-year-old, you know, if you think that you're going to go home and do your homework on time, let's ask ourselves, are we really going to go home and do our homework on time? What is the realistic narrative for what will happen over the weekend? Are you going to start on Saturday afternoon? Are you going to start on Sunday morning? Are you going to start on Sunday night? Are you going to start on Monday morning for the problem set that's due, or the homework assignment that's due Monday at 9 a.m.? And so I would help them understand, help them develop a realistic appreciation of their own behavior so that they then can optimize against that propensity. And if they understand they have self-regulatory problems, well, maybe now they'll begin to come to other solutions, and the solutions that we use, things like deadlines, things like commitments, moving away from the false optimism of, I'll do it after lunch. No, you won't do it after lunch, so you might as well do it before lunch. And a better understanding of their own delusions, of their own misforecast about their own behavior, I think would enable children, as it enables adults, to be much more functional. But that has not been tried, and so I pose it as a hypothesis to be explored, not as something that I think will work.
Wait, so let me just add to what David said. So if the prescription is train the metacognitive skills, that's the level that you're talking about, train metacognitive skills, that actually offers some constraints on when the training would be most effective. There are data that show that metacognitive skills start to develop at the ages of 3, 4, 5, but they're fairly primitive. And so if you were targeting metacognitive skills, I wouldn't go for preschoolers, because I don't think that they're going to get the message very well. I would take children who are more developed, 6, 7, 8-year-olds, for example, where the action might actually take hold.
I was thinking 10 to 20.
Even old, even older.
College students
Yeah.
would be on my list.
As a parent of a preschooler, I can completely attest that metacognitive skills have not yet emerged in your age groups.
Can I say something?
Sure.
There's been advocacy for training and self-control. And just to throw in a little bit of a devil's advocate position, one of the things we have to be cognizant of is that kids mature at their, put this in two parts. One is, here's a really interesting finding from the ADHD literature, which I'm very plugged into. A lot of what ADHD looks like neurally is a maturational lag. What that means is there's beautiful studies by Judith Rappaport at IMH where she tracks the cortical development and she constructs normative curves of what healthy kids look like as they mature and looks at regional maturation. And what ADHD looks like is the very same maturational curve, but delayed. In some places up to 5 years, in some places it's just 3 years, but it's very much a normal trajectory, except that it's lagged behind. And I have this kind of hesitation that we don't expect all kids to grow up in exactly the same way, and we ought to have at least some tolerance of diversity and there's going to be kids at the age of 7 that look like 4-year-olds, and there's going to be 11-year-olds that lag behind, and a lot of these kids do catch up. So it's diversity and a maturational trajectory. And so, bringing in the sledgehammer kind of interventions early what that may be doing is intervening too early for kids that need their own time and space to rejoin the normal trajectory. At the same time, childhood is a terrible thing to waste, being 3 or 4 years behind. It's very hard to know what to do with a kid who is 9 years old and behaves like a 6-year-old. They're not going to learn the critical skills they need in 3rd grade. So even as I'm talking in this devil's advocate kind of position, I realize that there's limitations to this view, and it's complicated.
Do you want to get in there now, Walter?
May I?
Please.
For me, moving to New York and having a chance to work in the schools in the South Bronx rather than in the Stanford being nursery school was an enormous personal experience. When I started doing the research with no thoughts about intervention, just an attempt to do marshmallow studies in public schools, I couldn't believe what I saw. I mean, as a kid in Brooklyn, I had gone to New York City public schools. It was a perfectly good education. But what I saw in this particular school, first of all, to get into one at the time, I'm not talking about work done in the mid-'80s and early '90s. To get into one required finding a principal after wasting 4 years on a grant just to try to get started in the public schools. A principal who was willing to defy the Board of Education, which didn't want anybody to see what's going on in those stone fortresses that are the public schools. So we got into this place, and I mean, first of all, you come in and you go through something that's a lot worse than airport security. I mean, there's barbed wire on the outside. There are 2 police patrol cars stationed on each side of the entry. I'm talking about mid-'80s and early '90s. This may be different even in the South Bronx now. So you go through the metal detectors and so on. And then when I finally got into the school, I heard this enormous roar of noise and went towards the noise to see what's going on. And I found all the kids in this enormous assembly hall that used to be called study period. And the teachers, the male teachers with batons, were walking through the aisles, screaming louder than the kids, sit down and shut up. And this was study hall. The kind of chaos that existed in those schools is hard to imagine. I mean, not only were half the lights out and, ceilings dripping water down and so on, but the lack of control was just stunning. Now, more recently, I've had the experience of connecting with the so-called KIPP schools, charter schools in New York. These are Knowledge is Power program, which is what KIPP stands for. And a remarkable guy called Dave Levin has headed these, has started these. He began in Houston, Texas, with 1 classroom. There are now 50,000 kids in KIPP schools all over the country. There'll be 100,000 by a couple of years from now. The change is not to be believed. I mean, it's a staggering change, a sledgehammer kind of change. And it begins with the fact that the schools are clean, that even though the budgets apparently are not much different from the school that's just on the other end of the corridor, which is the public school, then you go through this thing. And the first thing I couldn't believe is that there are musical instruments, expensive violins and guitars and cellos and so on in the hallway. And they're not touched. It was an amazing experience to be in those classrooms, to see teachers who are speaking in a soft voice and saying, thank you for matching my tone to the kids who responded. To be greeted by a little boy by the name of Malcolm, who welcomed me to his classroom. Each classroom has the name of a college on it. This was the Columbia Alliance. I mean, the change that is simply in the physical environment and in the psychological environment is so powerful and so dramatic. There's a thinking chair in the corner, a recovery chair, which is not at all like the like the dummy who gets to stand up in the corner, but rather the place where you go when you feel that you're losing, that the heart system is taking over. And you sit in that. There's a timer, and there are all kinds of helium balloons on the wall that you can see floating away with angry feelings and so on. It's just a totally different environment in which children are treated in a completely different way. And when I talked with the kids, one that I found particularly memorable said, my first day at KIPP, when he was 9 years old, was the first day in my life that I saw a connection between what I do and the consequences. Because previously I had been able to sit in the classroom and, roll my eyes when the teacher was talking and so on. Nothing happened. As a matter of fact, all I heard in the public school was teachers screaming at us saying, I don't know why I'm wasting my time. None of you are going to grow up to be anything anyway. So the recognition on the part of these kids that how they behave will actually have consequences is sort of a prior, even before we're talking about self-control training or executive function. These kids come in. I mean, one of the requisites for being at a KIPP school is you have to qualify for the free lunch program. That means you're really at the bottom socioeconomically. So you're coming from a very troubled environment. These are kids who, you know, they don't know the difference between the front cover of a book and the back cover. They come from homes where there aren't any books and where there isn't conversation and so on. So I'm just saying when we step out of the lab and actually look at what goes on in the public schools and what some of the reform efforts are that are going on now, the picture is, I think, both incredibly discouraging and incredibly encouraging. And the difference between the two is essentially good sense. You know, it's of which sort of the first prior is learning that what you do actually has consequences. This particular person I met at a KIPP school when he was 19 years old, and he was a student at Yale doing very well. But until 9, he said, I was sure I was going to spend my life hanging in the streets, you know, looking for a job.
So I'm also awed by the charter schools, and yet I'm devastated when I see the literature where we have random assignment into charter schools, and I'm just completely dumbfounded by the average result, which is very modest positive effects. I mean, borderline non-existent, but I think if you average all the studies together, my reading is that the effects, when you have random assignment, again, that's very critical, right? When you have parents selecting to send their kids to the charter school and you compare those kids to the kids in the public school, you see night and day differences. But if you take a set of parents who all wanted to get into the private school, into the charter school, I should say, and only half were able to be admitted and the other half went to the public school and everyone's tested 10 years later, those effects are just vanishingly small. I mean, they're positive in my view. So I struggle because I think to myself, surely these charter schools are transformatively better environments for kids. And I'm committed to improving our educational system. I think we should spend vastly more on education in the US, and I think the government should make those investments. And yet, I'm dumbfounded by the random assignment that shows very modest effects from these kinds of enormous interventions, which takes me back to this, you know, this struggle in wondering how do we transform these people's lives, you know, disadvantaged kids who really, I feel, are being grossly mistreated by our public schools, and yet the charter school doesn't seem to be making a night and day difference.
Well, I mean, I think what you say is very important and very alarming. My only comment on it can be that I don't think all charter schools are alike. And that there are good charter schools and there are not so good charter schools. There are some for-profit charter schools that are, you know, that to me are examples of doing at the early childhood level what Phoenix University or whatever does at the college level, which is a for-profit business that provides a lousy education. So I think. I don't know the answer, but I think results like that are certainly appalling. And I don't think there's some carte blanche for if it's a charter school, it'll work. But I think that there are ways of teaching kids that are effective. And one of the things that impresses me in these schools that I've been observing is it's not that they're tiny classrooms. They're still large classrooms. They're just conducted in a very different way. So.
I think there's an important issue, though, having to do with time on task. So one of the significant features of the KIPP schools is that the intervention doesn't last just during the school day, but rather there's actually training for the parents as well that pervades the rest of their lives. Whereas in many charter schools, I've done some work in the Detroit charter schools in connection with a project that I'm working on. It's, 9 to 3, and the other 18 hours of the day are unaffected. Yeah. And so it's kind of hard having an intervention that's only a quarter of the day expected to have a long-term effect. And I'm wondering whether that's part of a dilution effect.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sensitive to the time and entertaining questions if we have them. So I have one final question for everyone here. It's kind of a combined question. Over the past decade or so, certainly in psychology and neuroscience. I'm not quite sure of the funding situation in economics, but there's been a heavy bias towards putting funding towards the biological side of the equation. And in this conversation today, we've been really going back and forth between biology and what I think of as classically contextual, social phenomena. And so if you did have that alone time with Obama, you just did miss him. He was here last week. We asked him to be on the panel. He declined. Not really, but it'd be nice to have him there. But if you could get him, if you did control the purse strings, what would be your formula for the next 10, 15 years in terms of unpacking this concept and figuring out how to tweak it in ways that can actually improve people's lives? And if you don't think we should even go there and we should stick with mice, that's fine too. Does anyone want to jump in? We could have the Jeopardy music.
Yeah. I can say one observation about what it was like for me to learn science. And I learned science late because I went to philosophy grad school and then learned science afterwards as a psychiatry resident. I'm still learning science. Is the way that scientific hypotheses around the area of self-control, I started off in a neuroimaging lab, and the stuff you can learn sticking with one modality is so limited, and it barely budges your degree of belief in favor of this hypothesis versus that hypothesis. And then you end up finding collaborators, like collaborated with John and others, that are doing behavioral stuff, that are doing electrophysiological markers, that are doing pharmacological interventions, looking at the public health data the way that David does, and combining all that the way that Walter does. And so you started off by talking about the bias towards the biological. I think that is a mistake, and that this area is so complicated, and the only way that you're going to get progress in favoring this theory or this intervention is to get teams of people that are comfortable and form convergent cases that are mutually supportive. My experience has been the limitation of looking at things through one vantage point and the essential nature of combining everybody's perspective to try to figure out what hypotheses are going to be right and would lead to progress. So I'd emphasize that. It's probably non-controversial, but worth saying something about.
It's interesting because when I ask people this question, which I do often, this tends to be the common response. I completely agree with it.
Uh-huh.
It's just that the people who review my grants do not. So,
Yeah, right.
Well, but the people who review your grants are in turn selected by the people who run the programs, who are in turn selected by the ultimate bosses. And so the one to ask this question of is not us, a collection of us's, but rather a collection of people like the director of NIMH, who has a singular bias about the importance of biological information and a singular bias against the study of problems like self-control at various levels of analysis. I mean, it's quite, look,
As a card-carrying cognitive neuroscientist,
I'm a card carrier.
Would you agree with the importance of an integrative approach?
Absolutely. The target of funding should be the problem. The target of funding should not be the methods. Look, where has the greatest progress been made in understanding self-control? It's 50 years of Walter's work on this problem, not 5 years of my work on this problem. Case closed. And Walter's work was, to a first approximation, entirely psychological and behavioral. Put the money where the solutions can come out. Study the problem. Don't restrict yourself to a method. That's essentially what Chandra was saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree that we should be diverse in our methods, and I would emphasize that, of course, we should study behavior, because behavior ultimately is the driving force for so many social pathologies, and self-control seems to be implicated in many of these self-defeating behaviors. And we have plenty of examples of interventions that were almost free and have saved, just one intervention saves billions of dollars. And we should just ask ourselves, okay, can we design interventions that are scalable and that are cost effective and that have enormous social returns and that target self-regulation as a key mediating factor? And the answer is absolutely yes. It's been done, and we can keep doing it. And once you phrase it that way, it's an outrage that the funding agencies aren't more interested in these extraordinarily profitable investments for our society. Not only do they elucidate deep scientific mechanisms that we all care about, but they turn out to be practical solutions to the problems that ail us. And whether it's retirement savings, or whether it's human capital, or whether it's meaning education, or whether it's public health, self-regulatory issues are at the very center of the issues, at the very center of the problems that we have societally, and we can make a lot of progress with cost-effective interventions.
You know, the part that always puzzles me in this part of the conversation and on the biology is that the people who are in the positions of power, who are running NIMH and so on, are very good scientists. They're very good biologists. And what surprises me is that they don't seem to take account of what I think must surely be in every introductory course in biological science currently, which is that things like the stress that people experience changes what goes on in their brains, and that the kinds of things they eat or the kinds of things they smoke and so on, that their behavior, their thoughts, their feelings are influencing what goes on in their biology. That is, that it's a two-way interaction that's continuous. This seems to me so fundamental that I just really remain perplexed. I've had this conversation often with Eric Kandel, who's a friend and a colleague, and I think increasingly he really does see that. But I think that the orientation that people like Eric come to is really that all of the causality lies in one place, and they really have to be included in our conversation for that to shift.
Well, this feels now like the Oscars because the music is beginning to music should shut up. So any questions that people want to ask? There's you can use this mic.
Thank you for a fascinating conversation. I'm struck by the fact that all of you have drawn a tight connection between self-control and inhibition, even though you understand the range of impulses to be inhibited very broadly, to include not just the hot, appetitive impulses, but also cognitive tendencies. When I think intuitively about the capacity for self-control, and in particular about willpower, I think not just of cases in which people exercise self-control in order to refrain from actions, to resist temptation, whether it's cookies, drugs, sex, or even a cognitive temptation of sorts, but also willpower as the capacity to muster motivation, to get up off the couch and exercise, not just to diet. So I wonder if you could all comment on that capacity of self-control. Do you think it's the same faculty? Does it share a neural profile with the phenomenon that you study? Does it share a psychological profile? And is it amenable to the same sorts of self-regulatory tactics that you've been describing in some detail?
May I? It's an extraordinarily important question. And neuroscientists and cognitive neuroscientists in particular, let me back up. When Walter introduced this topic by now 2 hours ago, he said what this amounts to is attention regulation. And the way neuroscientists and cognitive neuroscientists think about attention regulation is involving two mechanisms. One is the one we've been talking about for 2 hours, this inhibitory mechanism largely. But there's also an enhancement mechanism that's discussed in the literature as well in connection with a whole variety of tasks. So you can think of it not only as down-regulation of behaviors that are inappropriate, but up-regulation of behaviors that are appropriate, of the sort that you were talking about when you talked about motivation to get up off the couch and go get on an exercise cycle. So I think in the literature, there is a recognition that the regulation goes both ways.
Anyone else?
Thanks very much. I'm a little sorry to hear the conversation end, but it's a follow-on to some extent to Gabe's question, which is, and it's partly inspired by a quote I see here from the Wedeco experiment. The staffers have a strong motivation in getting the kids to control their problematic behavior. And so one component of the picture of self-regulation is to have goals and values and motivations. And partly that's a matter about regulation, but it's also a matter about valuation and how we invest in goals and how we acquire values, processes by which we learn values. Teenagers have trouble with self-regulation. They also have the ability to invest a lot of affect into important goals and to change their lives in positive ways. And if we think of it in those terms, then sometimes there's a tendency to think that the regulatory part is the self, and the regulated bit is the non-self. But if the goals and the values and the concerns, for the sake of which regulation is ultimately going to occur, depends upon the self that isn't the regulator, but is the regulated, depends on the values and the motives and the goals, then I just wonder whether when we think about these cases, we should be a little aware that we should not be identifying the self with one or another of these elements, that the self is the two of them together. And so self-control can also mean not being motivated to regulate in certain ways. And that might be because you have a value which says, I'm going to break this rule. I'm going to act now. It's not prudent, perhaps. It may not be the sort of thing that's socially reinforced, but I'm willing to do that because I care enough about this goal. So I'd just like to hear a bit more about how the process of goal investment and development feeds into this picture of the self in the self-control.
Well, I'll jump in. I completely agree. I think when we talk about self-control, we reflexively think about dampening down emotional responses. But fundamentally, you could think about it as, first, what's your goal, right? What do you want to achieve? Then, can you muster the tools that are in the self-control toolbox, if you will, to allow yourself to achieve that goal, which could be killing someone else, actually, right? Right? I mean, truthfully, but we don't think of killing someone else. This is a dark topic, right? But actually, to suppress the emotions in order to achieve that goal, I think that qualifies as an act of self-control. And we just tend to not think about those instances, but I do think they qualify. I don't know if others here disagree with that. But
I would agree that that when we talk about the true self, that true self might live in the inhibitory realm sometimes, and it might live in the impulsive realm sometimes, and it might live in both realms sometimes. And so one should universally try to associate one or the other with the true self. Now, the classical examples of self-defeating behavior are when an impulse, a sharp, sudden impulse arises that leads one to act foolishly. And so we always begin with those examples to build intuition, but I don't mean to in any way suggest that is the canonical case. That is just an illustrative case.
there's actually, the clip that those of you who attended Walter's talk, the marshmallow clip, I've seen probably 10,000 times. So it's memorized. And there's a great instance of the little girl who looks around, looks up, thinks carefully, and then seemingly fully under control decides to
Absolutely.
I'm
Yeah,
done.
absolutely.
And I would argue that she is exercising self-control there in
Absolutely.
choosing, I'm done, I'm ready.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think what good self-control means for me is that the individual has choice. And then how the choice is used depends on all the points that you were making in your remarks, on the values, on the goals, on who am I and who do I want to be, where have I been and where am I going, and therefore ringing the bell can be the wiser choice to continuing to wait, particularly under circumstances, under many conditions in which the delayed rewards never even show up. So
one of the promises of Walter's work is that had she been trained to understand how to manage her emotions, I mean, I view the enormous promise of this body of work is the hope that one day we'll know how to take a kid like that and explain to them all of the tricks that you've revealed to us, whether it's attention, redirection, or any of the other cognitive maneuvers, so that even though she does want the 2 marshmallows, she wants the 2 marshmallows, she recognizes it's going to be costly, she decides in the moment, the cost of waiting is too great, I'm going to go for the 1. That's all rational. But wouldn't it have been even better if she knew the techniques that you know and that your subjects have revealed, had used them, and could have had her 2 marshmallows without the 15 minutes of suffering because she had attention redirection skills. And that, I think, is the hope that you've given us all, and where I do think she is making a mistake in the sense that lacking those skills, she had to go for the second best option.
well, it's not clear that she lacked the skills, though. I mean,
That's true.
she might have had the skills and really made a wise, for herself, decision.
I mean, so you
so-
think that's more likely?
I have no way of knowing. I had a feeling that that particular child was pretty good at.
Let me throw one other idea in there. You know, I really fundamentally believe that psychological processes, of which I consider self-control to be one, they're not good or bad, right? Whether they're good or bad depends on the context in which they're engaged. And I think it's easy we often talk about self-control as a good thing. We want to give more self-control. And so, you know, let me take that a step further. You can use self-control to do really bad things for yourself and for others. And context determines, I think, whether the outcomes are good or bad.
I think that's an excellent point to make. And one way to put it is the word self occurs in self-control, and the word self occurs when David refers to the true self. And are they referring to the same thing? And I believe the answer is no. The first use of self and self-control is just a reflexive sense of self. That is, self gets used in so many different ways, and self-control is control that's enacted by that very person. And the notion of self that occurs in true self is referring to something more like the things that a person fundamentally cares about, their personal values and their principles and the things that they hold dear. And so those 2 senses of self are not referring to the same thing, and it does suggest that your reflective system and your automatic system can holler for different things to do, and it's not always correct to use self-control, and there's a normative view lurking in the background. When is it correct to use self-control? When it advances the interests of the true self.
Which aren't always good, those interests, right? They could be for the self, but not necessarily for society.
Right, that's true.
That's right. There's different standpoints in which we might criticize the use of self-control. And I guess the point I just want to underline and emphasize is that self-control is not control in the interests of the true self. Those 2 things can very much come apart. Self-control is just reflexive control by that very person. The true self is a different construct altogether. And understanding the complex and the 2 very much can come apart, and self-control can be used destructively or inappropriately. Yeah.
I guess this is more of a philosophical question than a scientific one. So you talked about nudges and maybe implementing self-control in policy. And so is this a good thing? Is it morally correct to take away an individual's volition and the ability to make those judgments on themselves? And is that self-control, or is that other imposed control now?
Probably should define it. I think you're prepared to do this, Ethan, what a nudge is.
Yeah. Well,
report this one over to the expert here, actually. Would you?
Sure. So the word nudge has come to mean, and I think it's a little vague, but it has come to mean a policy enacted by a government or by some other institution, like a firm, an employer, that encourages one kind of behavior over another, but not by actually using strong paternalism in the form of an obligatory action or an obligatory outcome, but rather simply by making one or the other alternative easier to bring to fruition. So to make that explicit, or give you an example, think about auto-enrollment in the realm of retirement saving. When you auto-enroll a new employee in a 401k plan, you're not requiring them to save. You're simply making saving the default option, the passive option. And if they want to, they can opt out, but because you've made it so easy to save, almost everyone does save. So when you auto-enroll, you get 95% participation in workplace savings plans. And when you don't auto-enroll, you get 40% participation in workplace savings plans. So you get a 50 percentage point or more difference simply by changing the way that you enroll people when they become a new employee. Now you can use those and that, of course, savings we think of as kind of a self-controlled act. It's suppressing consumption now to have more later. I certainly endorse nudges as one of the many tools that we're probably should use as policymakers or as institutions. But I agree with you, there is a kind of unintended perverse consequence whereby we make people into passive agents. We essentially say, you don't need to do anything, we're going to take care of it for you, just disengage, stop paying attention, become unconscious because it's all being done on your behalf. That's one unintended negative consequence, a kind of nation of decision-making zombies. Though, of course, I'm exaggerating. I don't think that's such a terrible thing. I don't think that's actually happening through things like auto-enrollment. And then another one is, I think what you were pointing to, which is the problem that maybe there's some inherent desirability of agency, and that people should just, there's a kind of being alive in making decisions, being personally responsible, and that in and of itself is good. It's not that we're having this unintended consequence of making people decide to be passive. It's that there is something explicitly good about personal agency. I tend not to feel that strongly about that argument, meaning I don't see that there's an inherent value to getting people to make all these decisions. But I agree that there is some value, some modest, small value there. And my position at the end of the day is, if we can make an enormous change in human outcomes by using a relatively light touch nudge where people's choice is preserved, almost everyone agrees that's a good thing. And in fact, I would use that criterion. I mean, we should have a vote. If I enact a nudge and 30% of the population says that's a bad idea, well, let's get rid of it then. But in fact, with these nudges, almost 100% say, hey, you made enrolling in a 401k plan easier? Terrific. Even the people who opt out say, that was terrific. I think it was a good policy, even though it wasn't right for me personally. So by and large, the public loves it. I think the psychology is right, which is people have a tendency to be passive, to be lazy, to be distracted. If we make good outcomes easy and people like it, like the way we've made it easy, I'm all for it, despite these modest unintended negative consequences.
Well, I'll just add one point, well, two actually. First, I'm glad I asked you to define it because you did a much better job than I would have. But secondly, if you think of the ethicality of nudges, they seem a lot more ethical to me than the bombardment of commercials that I'm exposed to whenever I watch TV, which use psychological principles to get me to buy or consume things that are bad for me. Right? No one's asking my permission to watch those commercials. So when you do have a regulatory body, and maybe it's the populace, that's gives a stamp of approval. In terms of the cost benefit, it seems like almost a no-brainer. So I guess that's my not so shy position on these tools, Walter. And this is the final comment, by the way. So
Final comment.
Make it a good one.
I mean, I love the nudge work, And I also think it's a terrific way for thinking about self-nudging. That is, I see nudging as when you do it, and my only fear is that, if you became the American czar for nudging, given how successful the work is, that everybody's life could be nudged so successfully, there would be no need for self-nudging. So it's only if you triumph totally, and what you did for retirement planning also took over, so nobody's obese anymore, and it's a different kind of brave new world.
Yeah.
I think that's quite unlikely.
Impossible.
But what I think is, for me, a take-home message about the nudging is that freedom, for me, is an increasing understanding for the self of how I can and will or won't nudge myself about particular things. And that, therefore, I'm not distressed that the self-nudging doesn't generalize. I'm not distressed if what is done once I, either because of my own action or because of David's help, I've done with my enrollment plan, it doesn't affect, how I deal with chocolate mousse. So I think there's a very important connection between nudging from there and nudging from the self, and that the best thing would be, I think, if people really were able to nudge themselves sufficiently. Absent that, boy, am I glad you're doing the nudging.
I agree completely.
Just going to make a joke about partners nudging us. It's probably helpful too. But we've come to a close, so I want to thank everyone for a really fun conversation. Thank everyone here for sticking around. So.
Thank you.